What is Art? By Leo Tolstoy. Chapter 12. 3 conditions help our society to produce objects of counterfeit art. They are these. First, the considerable payment artists receive for their works, and the professional artist that this payment has created. Second, art criticism. Third, the schools of art. As long as art had not yet split in two, as long as only religious art was valued and encouraged, and indifferent art was not, there were no counterfeits of art at all. If any appeared, the whole people judged them, and they fell away at once. But once the division was made, once the people of the rich classes had declared every kind of art good, so long as it gave them pleasure, and once art that gave pleasure came to be paid better than any other work in society, then a great number of people gave themselves to that work. And the work took on quite a different character from the one it had before. It became a profession. And as soon as art became a profession, its chief and most precious property was greatly weakened, and in part destroyed. That property is sincerity. The professional artist lives by his art. He must therefore keep inventing subjects for his works, and so he invents them. And it is easy to see what a difference there must be between two kinds of work. On one side stand the works made by men like the Hebrew prophets, the writers of the Psalms, Francis of Assisi, the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, the makers of all the folk tales, the legends, and the songs. Those men received no payment at all for what they made, and they did not even attach their names to it. On the other side stands the art produced first by court poets, dramatists, and musicians, who were honored and paid for it, and later by artists by trade, who live by that trade and are paid by journalists, publishers, and impresarios, that is, by the middlemen who stand between the artists and the town public, the consumers of art. Here, in this professionalism, lies the first condition for the spread of false, counterfeit art. The second condition is art criticism, which arose in recent times. Criticism means that art is judged, not by everybody, and above all not by plain men, but by learned men, that is, by men who are perverted and at the same time sure of themselves. A friend of mine once put the relation of critics to artists in a half-joking definition. Critics, he said, are the stupid discussing the clever. One-sided, inexact, and crude as that definition is, it still holds a share of truth. And it is far more just than the definition which says that critics explain works of art. Critics explain, and what is it that they explain? The artist, if he is a real artist, has carried to other people in his work the feeling he lived through. If a work is good as art, then the feeling the artist expresses is carried to other people, whether that feeling is moral or immoral. If it has been carried to them, they feel it, and each of them feels it in his own way, and every interpretation is beside the point. And if the work does not infect people, then no interpretation will make it infectious. An artist's work cannot be interpreted. If it had been possible to explain in words what the artist wanted to say, he would have said it in words. He said it in his art because there was no other way to carry the feeling he had lived through. To interpret a work of art in words only proves that the one who interprets it cannot be infected by art. And that is exactly how it is. Strange as it may seem, the critics have always been the people least able of all to be infected by art. For the most part, they are brisk writers, educated and clever, but with the capacity for being infected by art, either quite perverted or shriveled away. And so these people have always helped, and still help, by their writings to pervert the taste of the public that reads them and believes them. Art criticism did not exist, and could not exist, and cannot exist in a society where art has not split in two, and where art is therefore judged by the religious view of the world held by the whole people. Art criticism arose, and could only arise in the art of the upper classes, who do not acknowledge the religious understanding of their own time. The art of the whole people has a clear and unquestionable inner measure, religious understanding. The art of the upper classes has no such measure. And so the judges of that art must cling to some outward measure. Their measure, as an English writer on aesthetics put it, is the taste of the best nurtured men, that is, of the most educated people. It is the authority of the people who are held to be educated, and not that authority alone, but the tradition handed down by such authorities. And that tradition is thoroughly unreliable. The judgments of the best nurtured men are often mistaken, and judgments that were once sound cease in time to be sound. The critics, having no ground for their judgments, go on repeating them. The ancient tragedians were once held to be good, and criticism holds them good still. Dante was counted a great poet, Raphael a great painter, Bach a great musician. And the critics, having no standard by which to sort good art from bad, not only count these artists great, they count every work of theirs great too, and worthy of imitation. Nothing has done so much to pervert art, and nothing does so much still, as these authorities set up by criticism. A young man produces some work of art, expressing in it, as every artist does, in his own particular way, the feelings he has lived through. And his work becomes known. And now criticism takes up the artist, and begins to say that his work is not bad, but that all the same he is no Dante, no Shakespeare, no Goethe, no Beethoven of the last period, no Raphael. And the young artist, hearing such judgments, begins to imitate the men held up to him as models, and he produces works that are not merely weak, they are counterfeit and false. Take our own Pushkin. He writes his short poems, Eugene Onegin, the Gypsies, his tales. They are works of uneven merit, but they are all works of true art. And then, under the influence of a false criticism that exalted Shakespeare, he writes Boris Godunov, a cold, calculated work. And this is the work the critics praise and set up as a model. Then come the imitations of imitations, Minin by Ostrovsky, Tsar Boris by Tolstoy, and the rest. Imitations of imitations like these fill every literature with the most worthless and useless works. The chief harm the critics do is this: they are men without the capacity for being infected by art. All critics are such men. If they were not, they could not take up the impossible task of interpreting works of art. And so they turn their chief attention to works that are calculated and invented. They praise those works, and they hold them up as models worthy of imitation. That is why they praise with such confidence the Greek tragedians, Dante, Tasso, Milton, Shakespeare, Goethe, almost everything he wrote. And, among the newer men, Zola and Ibsen, the music of Beethoven's last period, and Wagner. And to justify their praise of these calculated, invented works, they think up whole theories. The famous theory of beauty is one of them. And it is not only dull men who write their works straight from these theories. Gifted men do it too, and often even real artists force themselves and submit to them. Every false work praised by the critics is a door, and through it the hypocrites of art come rushing in at once. It is thanks to the critics, and to them alone, that our own age has become possible. They praise the crude, savage, and for us often meaningless works of the ancient Greeks, Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus, and above all Aristophanes. They praise the newer men, Dante, Tasso, Milton, Shakespeare. In painting, they praise the whole of Raphael, the whole of Michelangelo with his absurd Last Judgment. In music, the whole of Bach and the whole of Beethoven with his last period. And so we have been given the Ibsens, the Maeterlinks, the Verlaines, the Mallarmés, the Puvis de Chavans, the Klingers, the Boecklins, the Stucks, the Schneiders, and in music the Wagners, the Liszts, the Berliozes, the Brahmses, the Richard Strausses, and all that huge mass of useless imitators of those imitators. The way criticism has treated Beethoven is the best illustration of the harm it does. Among his countless works, many of them written to order and in haste, there are true works of art, in spite of the artificiality of their form. But then he goes deaf, he cannot hear, and he begins to write works that are wholly invented, unfinished, and therefore often meaningless and unintelligible as music. I know that musicians can picture sounds vividly enough, and can almost hear what they read, but imagined sounds can never take the place of real ones. Every composer must hear his own work in order to finish it properly. Beethoven could not hear, and so he could not finish, and so he sent out into the world these works, which are the raving of an artist, and criticism, having once declared him a great composer, fastens with special joy on precisely these deformed works, and hunts in them for extraordinary beauties. And to justify its praise, it twists the very idea of the art of music. It credits music with the power to depict what music cannot depict. And then come the imitators, a countless host of them, imitating those deformed attempts at works of art that the deaf Beethoven wrote. And then comes Wagner. In his critical essays, he first praises Beethoven, and precisely the Beethoven of the last period. He ties this music to Schopenhauer's mystical theory, a theory as absurd as Beethoven's music itself, that music is the expression of the will, not of the separate manifestations of the will at the various stages of its objectification, but of the very essence of the will. And afterwards he writes his own music on this theory, joining it to a still more false system for uniting all the arts. And after Wagner come newer imitators still, who move even further from art, the Brahmses, the Richard Strausses, and the others. Such are the fruits of criticism. But the third condition for the perversion of art, the schools that teach the arts, is perhaps more harmful still. Once art became art for a class of rich people, instead of art for the whole people, it became a profession. And once it became a profession, methods were worked out for teaching that profession. The people who chose art as their profession began to learn those methods, and professional schools appeared, classes in rhetoric or literature in the high schools, academies for painting, conservatories for music, theater schools for the dramatic art. In these schools they teach art, but art is the carrying to other people of a particular feeling that the artist has lived through. How can that be taught in a school? No school can call up a feeling in a man, and still less can a school teach him the thing that is the essence of art, to show his feeling in his own particular way, the way that belongs to him alone. There is one thing a school can teach: how to carry feelings that other artists have lived through in the way those other artists carried them. That is precisely what the schools of art teach, and this teaching does not help true art to spread. On the contrary, by spreading counterfeits of art, it does more than anything else to rob people of the capacity to understand true art. In the art of words, people are taught to write an essay of many pages on a theme they have never thought about, with nothing they wish to say, and to write it so that it resembles the work of authors who are held to be famous. That is what they teach in the high schools. In painting, the chief training is to draw and to paint from copies and from life, and above all the naked body, the very thing that is never seen, and that a man busy with real art almost never has to depict. And they teach him to draw and to paint as the old masters drew and painted. As for composing pictures, they teach that by setting themes like those the recognized celebrities of the past have treated. It is the same in the dramatic schools, where the pupils are taught to speak their monologues exactly as the tragedians held to be famous spoke them. And the same in music. The whole theory of music is nothing but a disjointed repetition of the methods that the recognized masters of composition used to compose their music. I have quoted somewhere already a profound saying about art by the Russian painter Bryullov, but I cannot help quoting it again, because nothing shows better what can and what cannot be taught in a school. Bryullov was correcting a pupil's study. He touched it in a few places, ever so slightly, and the poor dead study suddenly came alive. "You only touched it a tiny bit, and everything changed," said one of the pupils. "Art begins where the tiny bit begins," said Bryullov, and in those words he expressed the most characteristic feature of art. The remark holds for all the arts, but you can see its justice most plainly in the performing of music. If a musical performance is to be artistic, if it is to be art, that is, if it is to infect, three chief conditions must be met. There are many other conditions for musical perfection besides these. The passage from one sound to the next must be broken or joined. The sound must swell or fade evenly. It must be combined with this sound and not that one. It must have this timbre and not another, and much more. But take the three chief conditions: the pitch, the length, and the strength of the sound. A musical performance is art, and infects, only when the sound is neither higher nor lower than it should be. That is, when the infinitely small center of the required note is taken, and when that note is held exactly as long as it needs to be held, and when the strength of the sound is neither greater nor less than it needs to be. The slightest departure in pitch to one side or the other, the slightest lengthening or shortening of the time, the slightest strengthening or weakening of the sound beyond what is required, destroys the perfection of the performance, and with it the infectiousness of the work. So that infection by the art of music, which seems to come so simply and so easily, comes to us only when the performer finds those infinitely small moments that music needs for its perfection. It is the same in all the arts. A tiny bit lighter, a tiny bit darker, a tiny bit higher, lower, further right, further left, in painting. A tiny bit more or less in the intonation, or a tiny bit sooner, a tiny bit later, in the dramatic art. A tiny bit left unsaid, a tiny bit overtold, a tiny bit exaggerated in poetry. And there is no infection. Infection is reached only when, and only to the degree that the artist finds those infinitely small moments of which a work of art is made, and there is no possible way of teaching a man from outside how to find them. He finds them only when he gives himself up to his feeling. No teaching can make a dancer fall exactly on the beat of the music, or make a singer or a violinist take the very smallest center of the note. or make a draughtsman draw the one line out of all the lines possible that is the necessary one, or make a poet find the only right arrangement of the only right words. Feeling alone finds all of that. And so the schools can teach what is needed to make something that resembles art. They cannot teach art. The teaching of the schools stops where the tiny bit begins, and so it stops where art begins. And getting people used to what resembles art unteaches them the understanding of real art. That is why there are no people duller to art than those who have gone through the professional schools of art and done best in them. These professional schools produce a hypocrisy of art exactly like the hypocrisy of religion produced by the schools that train pastors and religious teachers of every kind. Just as it is impossible to school a man into becoming a religious teacher of other men, so it is impossible to school a man into becoming an artist. So the schools of art ruin art twice over. First, they kill the capacity to produce real art in the people who have the misfortune to enter them and to pass through a course of 7, 8, or 10 years. Second, they breed, in enormous quantities, that counterfeit art which perverts the taste of the masses and with which our world is flooded. If people who are born artists are to learn the methods worked out by earlier artists in the various arts, then every elementary school should have classes in drawing and in music, that is, in singing, good enough that any gifted pupil who has been through them could go on to perfect himself in his art, on his own, using the models that already exist and are open to everybody. These are the three conditions: the professional artist, criticism, and the schools of art. And it is they that have brought most people of our time to the point where they do not even understand what art is. And,